The Life of David Livingston, Part 20. Incidentally, Chapter 18, or Chapter 8. Livingston's second expedition to Africa. Among great men who have had much to do in directing the destinies of nations or any considerable number of mankind, there have been two kinds. One class who supposed they controlled events and by imperial will and power mastered circumstances and the course of providence. The other, composed of those who have modestly imagined they were but instruments in the hands of the superior power, through whom some of his beneficent designs were to be accomplished. Among the former was Napoleon Bonaparte, who probably thought that in many particulars God was entitled to high respect, but that in the general conduct of military campaigns he could not be compared with the French emperor. It's historically true that the men of this class have generally inflicted great evils upon mankind. Of the other class of great men, Dr. David Livingston is a conspicuous example, and the one thing of which he is most unaffectedly ignorant is his own genius. If the reader remembers the modesty that he modestly remarks near the close of his work, the way in which I was led while teaching the Bacawaians to commence exploration, he will, I think, recognize the hand of Providence. And he goes on to show how previously to this, Sebitune had gone north and from a country larger than France, expelled hordes of bloody savages and occupied their country with a people speaking the language of the Bacawaians. Then again, he was singularly turned toward the west instead of the east coast of Africa, in thus happening that when he returned upon the great expedition across the continent, the country was at peace and his life saved. Meanwhile, Sechele himself at Colenbeng had become a missionary to his own people, and they were becoming civilized. I think, he concludes, that I see the operation of an unseen hand in all this, and I humbly hope that it will still guide me to do good in my day and generation of Africa. But this explorer was withal eminently practical. He wanted British merchants as well as the English missionaries to go to Africa, and thinking that philanthropy and profit were equally interested, he believed that the explorations he had already made fully justified the opinion that still further discoveries might completely demonstrate the fact that Africa was not only a great missionary field, but might become of the greatest value in the commercial world through the production especially of cotton and sugar. I propose, he says, to spend some more years of labor, and shall be thankful if I see the system fairly begun in an open pathway which will eventually benefit Africa and England. From all which it is clear that the second expedition of Dr. Livingston to Africa, and which has not yet been concluded, was the result of a deliberate opinion that, with the blessing of heaven, he might be able to accomplish that which should result in great good to Africa, and at the same time help to increase the trade and commerce of his own country. Impelled by such worthy and unselfish motives, he again left England in March 1858 and sailed for Quillimane, and he had resigned his position as missionary for the London Society, but the British government had appointed him consul at Quillimane, with the understanding that he was not on his account to give up his character of explorer. On the contrary, he was supplied with a small vessel and, accompanied by a number of scientific associates, made a number of exploring expeditions by which his ideas in respect to the production of cotton and sugar and the overthrow of the slave traffic were greatly encouraged, and the conclusion reached that it would not be long before the opening of commercial intercourse between European nations and the tribes of South Africa. It was afterwards discovered by Mr. Young, in charge of the English expedition of search, which proceeded far up the Zambezi River, that the memory of Dr. Livingston was highly revered, and his influence manifested in the moral improvement of the people and the advancement of their material interests. Subsequently, Dr. Livingston made an expedition in a large region of country drained by the river Rovuma, which along the east coast of Africa is a sort of boundary between Mohammedan and Portuguese authority. For this expedition, a steamer was provided, but it was found to be of too great draught of water to be of much service. Dr. Livingston, therefore, with the object of accomplishing the great design of his second voyage to Africa, returned to England, having re-explored a large portion of country along the Zambezi, and visited for the first time the tribes of the large extent of country several hundred miles north of the Zambezi in its eastward course. This return to England was, however, but a part of the expedition upon which he had started in 1858, or rather, an episode in it, without which the original object, the discovery of the principal watershed of the African continent, included the sources of the Nile, would not have been accomplished. While, therefore, Dr. Livingston had made 3 voyages from England to Africa, it will be more convenient to group his series of explorations under the general heading of 2 great expeditions, the first under the auspices of the London Missionary Society, the second under those of the Royal Geographical Society, with special assistance from the British government. For the completion of the series of explorations of this expedition, upon which the explorer in 1872 still engaged, he left England August 14, 1865, accompanied by his daughter as far as Paris. Thence he proceeded to Bombay and provided himself with material and men for the work before him. From Bombay he proceeded to Zanzibar, and on March 28, 1866, he left that island accompanied by 2 boys, Shanma and Wakatatsi, a member of sepoys, several men from Johanna Island, and some Swahili from a school at Bombay, and having reached the mainland, proceeded to the interior by river Rovuma. As he proceeded, he from time to time sent back accounts of his progress and the interesting incidents of his exploration. But late in this year, the leader of the Johanna men arrived at Zanzibar with the story that Dr. Livingston had been murdered on the shores of Lake Nyassa by a band of Matutsus. The tale had such an air of truth that no one doubted it. Mutsa's story soon began being fully credited. The world quite generally gave up on Dr. Livingston as lost. Dr. G. Edward Stewart, resident agent of the English government in Zanzibar, condensed Mutsa's information into a dispatch to Lord Stanley, Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs, and which the following is the principal portion. Zanzibar, December 10, 1866. My lord, I send you the saddest news. Dr. Livingston, in his dispatch from Ngomano, informed your lordship that he stood on the threshold of the unexplored, yet as if that which should betide him had already thrown its shadow. He added, it is but to say little of the future. My lord, if the report of some fugitives from his party be true, this brave and good man has crossed the threshold of the unexplored. He has confronted the future and will never return. He was slain, so it is alleged, during a sudden and unprovoked encounter with those very Zulus of whom he says in his dispatch that they had laid waste the country round about him, swept away the food from above and in the ground, with an escort reduced to 20 by desertion, death and dismissals. He had traversed, as I believe, the terra incognita between the confluence of the Leonde and Rovuma rivers at Nyomano and the eastern or northeastern littoral of Lake Nyasa, had crossed the lake at some point as yet unascertained, had reached a station named Kampunda or Mapunda on the western, probably its northwestern shore, and was pushing west or northwest into dangerous ground when between Marenja and Mukliosoe, a band of implacable savages stopped the way. A mixed horde of Zulus or Mafilet and Nyasa folk. The Nyasa folk were armed with bow and arrow, and Zulus with their traditional shield, broad blade spears, and axes. With Livingston there were 9 or 10 muskets. His Joanna men were resting with their loads far to the rear. The Mafilete instantly came on the fight. There was no parley, no avoidance of the combat. They came on with a rush, with the war cries and rattling, and their shields and spears. As Livingston and his party raised their pieces, their onset was for a moment checked, but only for a moment. Livingston fired, and 2 Zulus were shot dead. He was in an act of reloading when 3 Mafilete leaped upon him through the smoke. There was no resistance, there could be none, and one cruel axe cut from behind him put him out of life. He fell, and when he fell, his terror-stricken escort fled, hunted by the Mafilete. One, at least, of the fugitives escaped, and he, the eyewitness, it is who tells the tale, Ali Musa, chief of the escort of porters. The party had left the western shores of Nyasa about 5 days. They had started from Kampunda on the lake's borders and had rested at Marenja, where Livingston was cautioned not to advance. The next station was Mahalavura. They were traversing a flat country broken by small hills and bounded by wood. Indeed, the scene of the tragedy so soon to be consummated would appear to have been an open forest glade. Livingston, as usual, led the way, his 9 or 10 unpracticed musketeers at his heels. Ali Musa had nearly come up with them, having left his own Joanna men resting with their loads far in the rear. Suddenly he heard Livingston warn the boys that the Matitsus were coming. The boys in turn beckoned Mutsa to press forward. Mutsa saw the crowd here and there between the trees. He had just gained the party and sunk down behind a tree to deliver his own fire when his leader fell. Mutsa fell for his life along the path he had come, meeting his Joanna men, who threw down their loads and in a body really passed Musa. His escape had and that of his party verges on the marvelous. However, at sunset they, in great fear, left their forest refuge and got back to the place where they hoped to find their baggage. But it was gone, and then, with increasing dread, they crept to where the slain traveler lay. Near him, in front, lay the grim Zulus, who were killed under his sure aim. Here and there lay scattered some of the dead fugitives of the expedition. That one blow had killed him outright. He had no other wound but this terrible gash. It must have gone from their description through the neck and spine up to the throat and the front, and it had nearly decapitated him. Death came mercifully in the instant's suddenness, for Livingston was ever ready. They found him stripped of his upper clothing. The Matsuis had represented him when dead, respected him when dead. They dug with some stakes a shallow grave and hid from the starlight the stricken temple of the Grand Spirit, the body of an apostle whose martyrdom should make sacred the shores of that sea which his labors made known to us, and which now, baptized with his life's blood, men should henceforth know as Lake Livingston. Dr. Seward added the following postscript to his dispatch to the Foreign Office. The date of Livingston's death is left as much to conjecture as a place of his grave. All we certainly know is that he was at Naumano on the 18th of May last, that he proceeded to Mataka, whence he sent a dispatch to this consulate from Mataka. He is said to have made for and struck Nyassa, which he crossed, but where Maka is, it cannot be ascertained. The runaway Reuben with the sepoys states that Livingston left Mataka a few days before they set out on their return journey to Zanzibar. They were 1 month and 20 days on the road to Kilwa, which they reached during the latter days of September. It may be inferred from this that Livingston left Mataka about the middle of last July. The Joanna men named 6 weeks as the probable time of their return journey from Mapunda to Kilwa with the slave caravans. The fight with the Zulus took place 16 days before they set out. They reached Kilwa in November, Zanzibar the 6th of December. Roughly then, we may conjecture that the death of their leader to have happened during September. The statements of our informants as to time, distance, and direction are distressingly vague and untrustworthy. The publication of this dispatch at once created a profound sensation throughout the civilized world. There being no apparent reason or to doubt the truthfulness of the story, it was quite universally accepted, and most men lamented the death of the great explorer with unfeigned sadness. The obituary notices which appeared in the public journals and proceedings of many learned bodies demonstrated the fame of Dr. Livingston in a manner which will surely be exquisitely agreeable to him when he shall read the eulogisms, as it is hoped he may soon do. Dr. Kirk of Zanzibar, who had in former years accompanied Dr. Livingston in some of his explorations, gave the man Musa a long and careful examination and cross-examination, and the longer he proceeded, the more terrible the facts connected with Dr. Livingston's death appeared. A letter from him, generally published and quoted by all journals, seemed to leave the painful reports fully and abundantly confirmed. The world's sorrow, therefore, expressed in every proper way, was to all appearance entirely reasonable. Nevertheless, there were those who did not put their trust in Musa's story. Among these was Sir Roderick Murchison, whose reputation for sagacity in England was very high. So early in 1844, Sir Roderick had announced from the examination of certain rocks brought to him for study the existence of gold in Australia, and had vainly endeavored to enlist the aid of the government in behalf of practically testing the question. We have seen that he correctly deciphered the general geological formation of central South Africa before the practical discovery of the fact by Livingston. By these and other things of like nature, Sir Roderick had acquired the reputation of a prophet. He could give no special reason for his opinion, but he did not believe Moose's story of Livingston's death, and the fact of his want of faith in it made many suppose there might be ground for doubt after all. Sir Roderick was sustained in his doubts by Mr. E.D. Young, an African traveler of considerable experience, who came forward and said that Ali Musa belonged to a treacherous race. Suppose he had betrayed Dr. Livingston, how else then, by a cunningly devised story of his death, could he prevail upon the British consul to pay him? Here at least was a motive for the story, and it soon had many to believe in it. The consequence was a variety of conflicting reports and conflicting opinions, in the midst of which the Royal Geographical Society organized a search expedition and placed it under the charge of Mr. Young. On the 8th of August, 1867, the little steel boat Search, Mr. Young in command, was pointed up the Zambezi River under the most explicit and comprehensive instructions from the Geographical Society. At Shupanga, the grave of Mrs. Livingston was visited, and such attention given it was as was required. On the 4th of September, Mr. Young heard of a white man having been seen on Lake Pamalobi, which is far south of Lake Nyassa, the scene of the reported death. Young proceeded thither and became convinced that the white man was Livingston. Continuing the search, he found that his views were from day to day confirmed by the reports of natives and articles which the explorer had left with them subsequent to the time of his reported murder. The search was continued till toward the close of the year, with the result that Dr. Livingston had certainly been seen at a long distance from the Lake Nyassa. Months after he had been reported killed, the expedition under Mr. Young did not find Dr. Livingston, but discovered enough to demonstrate that Ali Musa's story was an alibi and cunningly devised romance. Then the Geological Society received letters from Livingston himself, which proved that he was alive and well in February 1867, some 6 months after Musa's historic but vain defense near Lake Nyassa. Authentic reports of his presence on Lake Ujiji in October of the same year were received. But about this time, Sir Roderick Murchison published a letter in London, in the London Times newspaper, confidently predicting, on intelligence which he supposed to be reliable, Dr. Livingston's return to England about the coming Christmas. It has since transpired that Sir Roderick was imposed upon by a roundabout story from Trincomalee in the Isle of Ceylon, which had been based upon an entire misunderstanding of something that had been said by Dr. Kirk, British consul of Zanzibar, and the report of which was first transmitted from Trincomalee. Dr. Livingston did not appear in accordance with his friend's prediction, and the consequence was a new variety of reports of misfortune and death. Conjecture was free. Nothing had been lately heard from him. The suspense of the public in regard to the fate of one in whom there was so deep and universal interest was absolutely painful, and it was at this time of intense public anxiety that an expedition was set on foot, the like of which was not previously been known, and the complete success of which has bestowed upon its projector and commander imperishable renown.